this is not just two little kids, who happened to be there. They were there when the object crashed. They saw the crash. They lived through it. They went through the smoke and the fire and so on. So they rushed there, and what they confronted was not an airplane. It was this very large oval object. And then at the end of the recovery, which took 9 days, the object was packed and ready to go to be taken back to White Sands, to the atomic base. Mr. Padilla, the kid, Jose, crawled inside the object, and that's when he retrieved that bracket that we now have. I grew up in France, as you may know, very interested in astronomy. And then when I was a teenager, I was about 16, one very bright afternoon, blue sky, my mother was in the yard doing some gardening and called me, and I was working with my father inside the house. I came out and saw an object that was essentially a shiny disc, very clear, over a church that was about half a mile away from where we were. And it had a little dome on top, little transparent dome. I saw it for several minutes. The next day, I spoke to a friend of mine from college who was in a house about another half mile away from us, up a hill. This was just outside of Paris, about an hour drive outside of Paris. And he had seen it, and he had looked at it with binoculars. And I asked him to draw it, and what he drew was exactly what I saw. So that we never had any explanation. We never reported it. And I always carried that interrogation, inside myself. And then I sort of, let it go, because there were so many prototypes coming in at that point. This was about 1955. The first jets were flying. There was a base, an air base close to where we were. We thought maybe it was, some sort of prototype. And then this was reawakened when I read a book by Aimé Michel, who was really the first scientific writer who looked for patterns in the whole thing. And by then I was working at Paris Observatory. I had access to computers, and I started looking at it, and the patterns were there. So that's what convinced me to go ahead and continue this study.
Dr. Vallée, you and Paola have a book coming out called Trinity. What drew you to that particular case?
We came to it in two different directions. I was frankly late in taking an interest in crash cases, because every time we looked, there was some very interesting data, some residual samples, but no obvious. It was difficult to reconstruct the whole study. The witnesses came after the actual case and so on. And I started being interested through friends of mine in New Mexico. And I had started to go on digs in some areas and collecting data, because now we have, in Silicon Valley, we have the instrumentation to do a much more profound assessment of those materials. So we could get some ground truth. And the friend I had wanted me to come to that site in 1945 near San Antonio, New Mexico, not San Antonio in Texas, where something had happened. Unfortunately, he died. And at around that time, I discovered that Paola had done some research 4 years or 5 years before me, before anybody else. So she should talk about how she came to that case.
When I was in Italy, I'd read about two little Indian, they call them Indian boys. They weren't Indian, they were Hispanic, who had actually seen a craft crash in San Antonio, New Mexico, 1 month after the atomic bomb. The crash site is about almost 20 miles away from where the bomb exploded. And so I was thinking in my mind, why aren't my colleagues jumping on this? Because everybody's alive. You know, we can't find witnesses who are alive anymore. And it didn't happen. I was in Italy when this happened. When I moved back to the United States in 2007, I didn't know that in 2009, I would actually have access to one of the little boys. Now, those boys were 6 years old and 9 years old. And so the 6-year-old, I was able to talk to Remy Baca before he died. It was a long process. I began talking to him on the phone to get his confidence. And then, you know, I flew to Gig Harbor, Washington, where he was. And by that time, he had told me that he and the 9-year-old had seen the crash, had gone up to the craft, and had, because there was a piece of it that had blown off, they could see the beings. And he gave me testimony, and thank God, because then he died and I didn't have it anymore. So then I went to you know, that week that he died, I went to the 9-year-old because I was so afraid I'd never ever get to the crash site, and that I didn't want this to happen. These guys were in their 70s and 80s. So the thing is that, you know, when we're talking about this, Jacques and I, you have to understand that it was a collaboration between both of us that brought this story up, because by myself, what I do, and you guys know this, is I just do interviews. That's it. I just do the interview. I get their words. That's it. That's what's in the book, those interviews. But then when Jacques got hold of me, I think it was 2017, he was interested not only in the beings and the witnesses, he was interested in the fact that the 9-year-old had gone in and pulled a piece of metal from the inside of the craft. So he approached me on the scientific view of that. So when we were doing this pie, you know, baking a cake or whatever it is, we're baking this cake of a book. It took both of us from two different points of view to put it together. And I had just the interviews that I had from the two boys, but he's the one that was able to put together the story, the background, and everything. Of course, he met one of the, you know, boys, and he was Jose Padilla. And then just before the book came out, we found another witness. So it delayed the debut of the book, but also she was very important to this case.
Now, Dr. Vallée, Mark and myself, we're very interested in the scientific aspect of this as well. How did you develop this over time? This idea, your scientific approach, because you've kind of, I would say, like a bit of a lone wolf. You haven't gone with the mainstream. And for that reason, you've really developed a lot of things. How did you do that scientific approach?
So there are two possible approaches, and both of them have been tried. One approach is that everybody has been hoping to find the definite case. You know, the case that, as Dr. Hynek said, you know, you could take it and run up the steps of the Academy of Sciences, and you put it on the desk and you say, here, doctors, you know, you can't deny that. Well, that rarely happens in science. Usually science is done by incremental discoveries, incremental research, which is what's being funded. I mean, so if you want money from the government, that's what you need to do. You propose a new hypothesis about something, and you go one more step. There are exceptions to that. One exception is, of course, the discovery of meteorites. Astronomers had always denied that meteorites that farmers found in their field were extraordinary, that they fell from the sky. because, first it happens very fast. So you're never sure of the testimony. And also, you look at the sky, you don't see any stones. So and it took one case in the mid 19th century where so many meteorites fell on the same little town and destroyed the roofs and killed the dog and so on, that there was no way to deny that they fell. So there are some exceptional things that have turned. Well, with UFOs, it's never happened. There has never been one case that would make everybody stop and be convinced. And I think it's unlikely to happen because there are so many parameters involved. The other approach is to look for patterns. And I was trained in physics, but I'm really not an astrophysicist. I haven't practiced in that field. I'm really a computer nerd. If a computer guy. So I've worked a lot with databases. I've worked assembling patterns of observations. First with Dr. Hynek, and then for the Condon Committee, and then in France. I'm on the scientific advisory board for the French government program, and we've assembled a number of databases there. And when you look at the patterns, which is what Aimé Michel wanted to do, you find that it does not match any other phenomenon in science. It doesn't match, the periodicity of Mars. It doesn't match Venus. It doesn't match any obvious thing in the sky. And it doesn't match any pattern in the environment either. So when I go into a case like the San Antonio case, or Jose Padilla case, since he's the main witness, I try to understand the culture. I try to understand the context, and I try to understand the geography and the history to put the story in perspective. I've seen too many cases where some researcher decides he's going to go to Kazakhstan and investigate something for 3 days. You can't do that. Okay, yeah, you have to, and you saw that in Latin America. You have to understand the culture. You have to understand the nuances before you can really study a case. So I wanted to do that in New Mexico. I had been in New Mexico several times before. I had worked there with Dr. Hynek because we had a small observatory in New Mexico. All those things converged really to highlight the significance of the case that Paola had started to document. And her interviews, she says, I just do interviews, but her interviews are extraordinarily detailed and professional. And she knows how to stop and let people reflect and go back into that time, relive the experience. And that was extraordinarily rich.
Okay, great. Now, this question is directed to both of you. With the book coming out, are there any other aspects of it you'd like to get across to anybody that may be interested in buying it?
I want to say something about research in general. One of the reasons why Jacques and I got along so well and we could work is because we're both European. I had a vast, knowledge of history because, I'm Italian and my father was the Italian consul and I lived a historical life. I mean, I read books, I know history, and I could have a conversation with Jacques. Jacques read, that book has a lot of annotation, a lot of research of the atomic bomb, the 1945, Oppenheimer, the scientists, what was going on in World War II. And for me, he actually filled up the mosaic. I did the interviews, but then when I saw what was going on in New Mexico, and I understood, the mind of the scientists, this is something that is indigenous, I think, more to Europe than America, because usually the UFO community here gets one slice of the mosaic, they run with it, and they never bother to look at the whole picture. And I don't understand how you can understand what's going on unless you put the puzzle together. Anywhere I go in field research, I'm fascinated by the framework. And I could have never done this story with just interviews in a million years. Jacques once said, you gave me he said, I am the canvas, you gave me the colors. And I think it has to be that way. So may I encourage in the future UFO researchers to collaborate instead of take ownership of the story and run with it. Because if they would collaborate, they'd find the answer a lot quicker.
There are some aspects of this case. I mean, I could, I could lecture at a school, for example, about the case without hardly mentioning the UFO, just on the historical things that you can learn from just the setting and the witnesses and who they are and what the interactions are. And of course, I was born in 1939. So by the time France was liberated, I understood war. I mean, the town where I was born was bombed 17 times because it controlled access to Normandy from Paris through 2 bridges, including a railroad bridge that the Germans wanted to use to move supplies and to move troops. So everybody wanted to blow up those bridges. And as a result, in those days, there were no laser bombs and so on. Much of the town was destroyed, including the house where I was born. So but I didn't know much about Japan. I didn't know, they don't teach much about in France about the war in the Pacific, which of course went on to a climax after the victory in Europe, after VE Day. And I read the books about the UFO, in New Mexico. There were a couple of mentions. There was no book about it, but it was mentioned in passing by several good books that were talking about UFO crashes in general. The one thing that they all missed was the atom bomb. I mean, they all talk about these two little kids in that field, working for their father, taking care of the cattle. They are very bright. They have binoculars and they know how to use binoculars. They know how to drive a truck. Well, why? Well, because all the adults were at war. And, the work on the farm was delegated to the kids. And the kids had to, of course, they had to drive the truck to go to the field, and either the truck or the horses. And of course, they needed to use binoculars because the properties were huge. The ranches, that particular ranch is 80,000 acres, okay? 80,000 acres is a lot of territory. And so they would look at the cattle from a distance and look at the brands, and to recognize the brands, they needed to use powerful binoculars, the same type of binoculars the army would be using. So this is not just two little kids, who happened to be there. They were there when the object crashed. They saw the crash. They lived through it. They went through the smoke and the fire and so on, because they thought it was an airplane that crashed. And they knew that when that happened, if you were the first on the scene, you had to help. You had to go there to help the victims, or to arrange for support to come in for, the medical support or whatever. So they rushed there, and what they confronted was not an airplane. It was this very large oval object that we determined was probably weighted about 4 to 5 tons. Well, that's not a weather balloon. the Air Force, the Army Air Force. In those days, this was before the Air Force existed, but the Army Air Force, of course, called it a weather balloon, and that's why they needed to bring an 18-wheeler to take it away. So it was a very, very heavy type of weather balloon. 3 people had the opportunity to go inside. Mr. Padilla's father went inside with a state policeman from New Mexico the day after the crash, 2 days after the crash. And then at the end of the recovery, which took 9 days, the object was packed and ready to go to be taken back to White Sands, to the atomic base. And the truck was left alone for a while, and Mr. Padilla, the kid, Jose, crawled inside the object, and that's when he retrieved that bracket that we now have, that Paola has been talking about. So there was all that combination of things, but that was 2 days after the capitulation of Japan. What kind of signal is that for the US government? That there is this gift that's presented, you know, essentially an intact spacecraft with no visible propulsion system, where we know all the details of how it got there. It hit the tower, there had been a thunderstorm, it hit a communication tower, and then it landed, but it was under power when it plowed essentially a path into the landscape, made a turn under control, and came to a stop. And only it wasn't destroyed. So it had tremendous integrity. It was very, very strong. And, you know, this needs to be put into the history of the time. Japan had just capitulated, but, you know, the army, you know, everybody was still essentially, you know, the army had not been disbanded, or people had not returned to their homes. The soldiers who were sent to retrieve it, this was not a Spielberg movie with people in special suits and respiratory thing and doctors and biological warfare equipment and so on. This was just a bunch of 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds who were mostly interested in doing what they had to do and then going and having ice cream at the local, local cafe. And the officers who came to investigate spoke to the father. They spoke Spanish. You know, this is a Spanish country. This is New Mexico, okay? And of course, they are going to speak Spanish. And the officers were themselves, you know, of Spanish culture. So that was the easiest way to communicate. So when people make movies about this, they miss all of that. The bomb that had been exploded at ground zero was a test. So if you read a book about it, they will talk about Oppenheimer, they will talk about Enrico Fermi, and they will talk about the test that they did to prove, that the plutonium bomb could be designed and exploded. And well, what kind of a test was it? Well, the bomb that was exploded at ground zero in New Mexico was essentially the same power as the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki, the Nagasaki Navy base in Japan. This was not a test. I mean, when you do a test in science, I was taught you take a small amount of something, you put it in a glassware and you mix it with acid and you do something and you see if the reaction works. And then if the reaction works, then you publish your findings and you get a patent, and then maybe some big industrial company is going to buy your patent and they'll turn it into an industrial process. And that takes 10 years. Well, this was a full-scale nuclear bomb. And it had the same effect as a full-scale nuclear bomb, except that it didn't burn completely. So it showered the landscape over an area that covered about 70,000 people who had not been told about this, because this had to be secret, of course, and for good reasons. You can argue now whether they should have found some excuse for evacuating the people, but they didn't. And it rained, you know, radioactive particles for days, mixed with wind and rain and everything else over the whole thing, filling cisterns that people were using for drinking water, polluting the environment for cows who started dying or developing strange. Women started having problems with childbirth, and nobody said anything. And it took 10 or 15 years for the military to realize what had gone on there and then to start taking precautions. They did, to their credit, they never blew up another atom bomb there. They moved to Nevada, to the Nevada test site, where they could do essentially anything they wanted. But all that I discovered, you know, I didn't know the history of the war in Japan. It's extraordinary. And the way Japan capitulated, what the atom bombs meant to the culture of Japan and meant to the American culture and meant to American science. So all of that we put in the book. So the book is not just about some flying saucer, because there is no flying saucer there. The term flying saucer hadn't even been invented. And to me, this was an extraordinarily rich experience. And I've gone back to the field 4 or 5 times with Paola, meeting the Padilla family. Paola found the third witness, Sabrina, who came in later and could tie everything together, because she came in and was a witness to the things that the family was doing afterwards with some of the metals, some of the samples that were found in the landscape that the army hadn't collected. So the whole thing is extraordinarily rich. And I'm very grateful to have been involved in it, because it was, from a pure scientific point of view, and from a historical point of view, it put so many things in perspective for me.